Hey dudes, welcome to Splat from the Past, the only 80s themed horror and sci-fi show where things can get totally radical. Now today, I will be welcoming Mike Becker. He was the piano player at the Comedy Store in West Hollywood for many, many years, and he was Mitzi Shore's assistant for many, many years. I'm having him on the show today to talk about all the craziness that happened at the Comedy Store in those days. All the great comedians he saw, you know, the ghosts, just everything, the evil stuff that happened in that place. Everyone knows I'm obsessed with the Comedy Store. I just love that place. Every time I've been there, I just love it. There's so much history there and so much mythology. And I'm going to talk to Mike today about that. And it's going to be pretty fucking awesome. I can't wait. So, yeah, here is my interview with Mike Becker.
Hello.
Hey, Mike, how are you doing?
Hey, Tommy, what's up?
Oh, not much. Just nice sunny day over here in Reading.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of nice here. It's not as humid as it's been for a while.
Yeah.
How's your knee?
Same as usual.
Yeah, I hear you. Oh, so, what do you want to do?
It's such an honor. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, that's silly. It's not an honor to talk to me.
Oh, you don't sell yourself short. I mean, you're a part of the Comedy Store as much as anybody that was there at that time.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I was the closest to Mitzi, I guess, at that time. Running the business and stuff, yeah.
So
very weird. So
yeah. So you played piano at the Comedy Store, but going back in time, how old were you when you started playing piano?
Oh, I was very, very young. What happened was my mother is a piano teacher, and there was always a piano in my house and an organ. And the problem was is that she didn't want to teach me how to play because it was like, you know, a busman's holiday. In other words, you know, she was teaching all these other kids. So when she came home, she didn't want to teach, you know, her own kids. But I taught myself the piano. I think it's because my own theory is that I was in her stomach for 9 months while she was playing the piano. And for some reason, I picked it up in my brain waves, and I don't know why, but I just taught myself how to play. It's not any genius or anything, but I learned the chords, I figured out the patterns, and then I started to play probably when I was about 8, and then I played in rock bands and stuff. I actually took drums. I took drum lessons for many years, and I was a drummer, but I sucked at the drums. So I bought an electric piano, and then I played piano in rock bands in the 70s on Long Island, New York. And I did that for a long time. And then I had a friend of mine, his name is Paul Regina, who became an actor. We went to high school together, but he became an actor, and he actually became fairly successful. He was a star of a couple of TV shows and TV series and stuff like that. And he moved to L.A., and he kept telling me I should move to L.A. because this is where it is, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know if I wanted to record, you know, play piano, write songs, become an actor, whatever. It was one of those things. So I just took him up on it, and I moved to L.A., and one day he said that the Comedy Store had singer showcase night, which was kind of weird, but they had it up in there's 3 rooms at the Comedy Store. I don't know if you've gone over this with everybody else from the Comedy Store.
Yeah.
But the upstairs room, there's a small room, probably seats about 60 people, called the Belly Room.
Right.
And up there on Monday nights, when downstairs it was in the original room, it was potluck night, which was amateur night.
Right.
And in the main room, it was group comedy, which is sketch comedy. where Robin Williams used to work out with a bunch of guys. And up in the belly room, she had this singer showcase thing, which was kind of weird. And so my friend Paul, God rest his soul, he passed away about 10 years ago or so. But he grabbed me, and said, let's go do this because you've got songs that you wrote. Why don't you go do this at this Comedy Store place and maybe somebody will see it or whatever. And I was like, I don't know, because I really don't know how to sing. But I went along with it anyway. So we went to the Comedy Store, and we didn't know where to go, so we sat out in front where all the amateur comics were. And didn't know. We thought that's where we were supposed to go. And then we noticed there were other people walking around the back. So we followed them, and we ran around the back of the Comedy Store where there's a back hallway. And at the end of that hallway is the stairs leading up to the belly room. We asked somebody, where's this singer showcase thing? And the guy pointed up the steps to the belly room. So we went up there, opened the door. At that time, I had this big black fire door. We opened the door, and there was a comedian named Argus Hamilton.
Right. Argus.
You know.
Yeah.
Was sitting there eating his dinner, watching a football game, Monday Night Football, and he was the only person in the room. So I kind of recognized him from the Tonight Show, and I said, I'm sorry, is this where the singers thing is? He said, yeah, come on in. And, so we both went in, and we sat down, and there was nobody else in the place. And then Argus got up and said, good luck, and he left. And I went over to the piano. It was a small little piece of crap console piano.
Yeah.
That was beaten up, and I started rehearsing, just practicing. And then people started coming up the steps, the real singer showcase people who've been doing it for weeks. And they came in, they started filling in, so I stopped playing. And Paul and I sat down at a table, and we ordered drinks, which at that time, we were both going, holy crap. And then all of a sudden, this little bag lady comes out of nowhere and comes out to the room and says, who is playing the piano? And it was Mitzi. It was Mitzi Shore. I didn't know who Mitzi Shore was. And Mitzi dressed very eccentrically, is the word.
Yeah.
She used to wear, like, babushkas and bandanas and boas and
feathered boas, yeah.
Flowery, clothes and stuff and pants. She used to wear like big, billowy pants, and she looked weird to me. I didn't know who she was, and so I said, well, I was just playing. She said, oh, you playing very well. I said, well, thank you very much. I didn't know who she was. So she left, and about 2 minutes later, a woman came bounding up the steps. Her name was Joanne Kohler, and she was Mitzi's talent coordinator at the time. This is 1981, by the way, over 1981. And she said, I told Mitzi my name. I said, I'm Michael Becker, and she said, oh, okay. And so Joanne came running up the steps and said, who's Michael Becker? And I said, me. And she said, do you want to play piano here? We have an opening for a piano player. And I was like, well, how much does it pay? I didn't really know what the deal was. I didn't even know they had piano players. And at the time, I was also playing piano at a Shakey's Pizza Parlor when I was making $11 an hour plus tips, which in 1981 was okay, And so they paid $20, I think, $20 a night. And my friend Paul said, do it, you got to do it. It's the Comedy Store. So I figured, okay, and I gave her my name and number. I figured I'd never hear from him again. And a week later, she called me, and she said, can you play Friday night? And I was like, I guess so. And so I had no idea what I was supposed to do. It was all like bam, bam, bam. And so I show up at the Comedy Store, and of course, nobody knows who I am. I go up to the doorman, and I said, I think I'm supposed to play piano here tonight. And the guy said, yeah, okay, well, you have a ticket? Like, oh, man. So then I remembered Joanne's name. I said, oh, it was Joanne? that hired me to play piano somewhere, and he said, "Oh yeah, you must be the guy that's going to play in the belly room." So he showed me how to, I said, "Well, yeah, I've been there before." So I went up to the belly room, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I didn't like hang out at comedy clubs. I'd been to the Improv like twice.
Mm-hmm.
So I really didn't know what piano players are supposed to do. And I was scared out of my mind, what am I doing here? But at that time, the belly room was for female comedians. Mitzi was very supportive of women comedians. She wanted to get a lot of women going on their careers, which you have to give her a lot of credit for.
Right.
And so at the time, the belly room was generally for female comedians. And so I met that first night and subsequent nights a lot of really sweet, nice people. There was Lotus Weinstock, who is a wonderful human being. God bless her soul. She passed away.
Yeah, she's funny.
Too soon. And a bunch of other people. There was like people you'll never heard of, Cecil Glass and Carrie Snow, and
love Carrie.
Those people, Carrie.
Yeah.
And just some great people, and they were very helpful. And basically, the job I found out was to play the piano for like a half hour as people are being seated, and then to introduce the first comic, and then they take it from there. And then each comic that comes up, you play the piano, like a little intro for.
Mm-hmm.
And it became like fun. I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. I like doing this. And they would introduce me from the stage, Michael, here's Mike Becker over there on the piano. Hey, how you doing? Which they never did at Shakey's. And so I really enjoyed it, and I started doing it, but it wasn't a whole lot of money.
Yeah.
And eventually I asked somebody that, is there another job, a part-time job or something I could do here that, I can make some extra money? And they said, well, Mitzi hires guys to work the switchboard. So why don't you find out about that? So I did, and I got a job working during the day running the switchboard, which is basically answering phone calls, like incredibly stupid calls, like what time does the 9 o'clock show start?
Yeah.
That type of stuff. As a matter of fact, I made a list of stupid questions that we got all the time. There was a million of them. There was like one guy called and said, okay, well, what room is the girls in the nude? And I was like, okay, no, that's not this place.
Yeah.
And we had somebody called and said once, what, do you have an age limit? Because I'm bringing 2 minorities tonight. And I said, well, I don't care. It doesn't matter what color they are, as long as they're over 21. Yeah, she didn't understand what I was talking about.
Yeah.
So I worked the phones for a while,
mm-hmm.
and Mitzi kind of took a liking to me,
Yeah.
And she made me her assistant. And then I started to be more involved in the business, and then I became kind of her right-hand man. And I still play piano. So I was playing piano. I was working during the day. She gave me my own office, and I would do basically what every assistant does, make her phone calls for her, make arrangements for her, make appointments, get airline tickets, all that crap. And then also, Mitzi was I love Mitzi. There's part of me that really loved Mitzi because she was a tiny little person,
mm-hmm.
like 5'1". And she kind of reminded me of my mother because my mother was 5 foot.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just wanted to hug her and squeeze her. And she could be very nice to you. And I remember I had just started working the switchboard, and it was around Christmas time, and she bought me a television because she found out I had an old TV. It was like, I didn't hardly even know her, really, She's very sweet like that. But she also had a way of looking at the world that was kind of, it was a combination of narcissism and delusion, where she thought that her idea of how things should be was the only way to go.
Yeah.
So if you disagreed with her, she hated you.
Yeah.
And people would try to tell her things like, for example, we went through, and I was there for 17 years. I left in 1998, which is a whole nother story.
Oh, we'll get to that.
She would go through accountants like water. Every 5 minutes we'd have a new one, because in the 90s, the comedy business kind of took a little dive. In the 80s, the late 70s and early 80s, it was the business to be in. It was like a cash cow, because you had all the famous guys coming up. You had Richard Pryor and Robin Williams and Gary Shandling, and all those guys worked out of the Comedy Store. And they would come in even after they were famous to work out new material, or Robin would just like to work on his chops, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Robin was a great guy. He was very friendly and very off-stage, very not aggressive, you know, or, you know, he would stand in the hallway and wouldn't really say much unless you talked to him, and then he was just a nice guy. But, you know, if the comedy business in the late 90s, in the early 90s, what happened, my theory, is the TV kind of diluted the quality of the stand-ups, in the sense that they found out, television producers found out they can make a fortune on stand-up comedy shows. Yeah,
Evening at the Improv and all that.
Yeah, Evening at the Improv and the half-hour comedy hour.
MTV, yeah.
And there was a million of them. I mean, every cable channel had a stand-up comedy show. And they paid the comics, you know, guild minimum, which was a couple $100.
Mm-hmm.
And it cost them nothing because they taped it at a comedy club. So they just paid a location fee. And they just had to hire a crew and edit it, and that's it. So they made a lot of money doing this, and so they proliferated, you know, all over the place. But what happened was they needed, you know, the more famous comics didn't do those shows. It was the comics that are up and coming.
Right.
And they needed warm bodies to put on the stage, because the comics realized after a couple of minutes that once they did their act that they had been doing for a few years on one of those shows, it killed the act because people have heard it now. So they had to come up with new material. And also you had them hiring people that were not particularly good.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember seeing guys on, you know, like Evening at the Improv even, or the MTV show, who were our doormen at the Comedy Store, who weren't good enough to even get up on the stage of the Comedy Store, but they got a gig on these shows because they had like 3 jokes that were somewhat funny.
Yeah.
And, you know, I remember our parking lot guy that we just hired to park cars was on one of those shows. And I'm not going to name any names, and it was like, holy crap, how did he get on that show, you know? Because they need them. They needed bodies. They needed people to just fill the airtime. But what happened was, after a couple of years, I think people were watching those shows, and 2 things happened. One is they were saying, well, why should I pay, you know, $100 to go to the Comedy Store with parking and drinks and cover charge for 2 people at that time, when I could see it on TV for free? And then also, after a while, the quality of the comedy was so bad on those shows. People were saying, well, why would I spend $100 to see that crap? And I think, and also the other factor, there was such a blanket a blanketing of the country of comedy clubs. I mean, every bowling alley in the world became a comedy club. You know, every two-bit tavern became a comedy club or had comedy nights.
Yep.
And so you had all these people that were not very good working in these clubs because the clubs needed bodies. They needed warm bodies to get up on stage, and they paid them practically nothing. And so it was a cash cow for these comedy club owners. And most of those guys came to L.A. because they heard of the Comedy Store and the Improv. And it kind of diluted the comedy pool of quality. There's not, you know, in the 90s, you didn't have a whole lot of Robin Williamses coming up again, you know, or Arsenio's or Gary Shandlings or those people. I mean, if you think about it, it's hard to remember like a really famous person that came up in the 90s, except maybe Dave Chappelle or Louis C.K. or something like that.
Yeah.
But not a lot of people, not the same quality and quantity of people that came up in the 70s and 80s. Because back then they had to work really hard to get on stage. They had to be really good to get on stage. You know, I mean, Jay Leno, some people, you know, don't like Jay Leno, probably because they've only seen him on The Tonight Show. But Jay Leno was one of the hardest working comics in the world.
He was brilliant. Yeah.
He had new material every week. You know, he would write new material. And he also had, I mean, he worked like 360 days a year, you know, on the road. And these guys worked really hard to be really good. And then in the 90s, you had guys who didn't really have to work really hard to get semi-successful. Because if you could have in your credits that you were on television, then the club owners would hire you. You know, even if you sucked, because, you know, it could say on their marquee, direct from Evening at the Improv, Joe Schmo.
Yeah.
You know, and those guys really never made it. There was a whole strata of those comedians that never really made it famous because they were okay, but they weren't the quality of the Robin Williams and those guys who worked really hard to be really good. And and so the Comedy Store in the 90s kind of to wane a little bit, and she started to lose money.
Yeah.
But mostly because she made some incredibly bizarre business decisions. One was to buy a restaurant located directly across the street from the Comedy Store on Sunset Boulevard. At the time, it was called Roy's, and it had been there for 100 years. I mean, John Barrymore used to drink there. You know, that's how old the place was.
Wow.
And the guy who owned it, it was vacant for a long time, and Mitzi had this idea to lease it from the guy and turn it into the Comedy Store Annex. And make it a restaurant where people who were waiting to go to the Comedy Store show could eat dinner. That's a great concept, except the fact that she didn't know how to run a restaurant. And Mitzi kind of tended to hire sycophants, people who were kind of yes men.
Yeah.
And she didn't listen to people that had really good ideas because a lot of times those people had their own egos. And so, you know, she didn't like that. She had to be the number one. She had to be the person with the idea and the person with all the perfect ideas that know how to, you know, everything she did was the right decision. But that place was a disaster. She lost a lot of money. It went through 3 different permutations. She had a guy that was working at the Comedy Store as the nighttime manager. He was from Thailand. His American name was Kirk. And I didn't really get along with the guy, but that's another story. But he hired all Thai people to work in the bar at the Comedy Store, and Mitzi liked all the Thai people, mostly because they didn't say anything.
Yeah.
They didn't talk back. And his idea was to turn into a Thai restaurant, so they called it Thai Us, and that lasted about 6 months. And then it became a seafood restaurant called Barrymore's Place for Fish because of the legend of Barrymore having been there. And on a side note, the Barrymore's son used to come there, who was also a raging alcoholic, and he was like the only customer, the only regular customer, and he would hang out there and drink at the bar.
Oh, boy.
But that place was a total disaster. And finally, it was vacant again, but she was still paying rent. And she hooked up with this guy who, his name was Greg, I think, and Gregory.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked her. He was a real smooth talking guy. As a matter of fact, he worked for the governor of Louisiana, who was put in jail for fraud, the governor. And so he was like one of those guys.
Yeah.
And he talked her into turning into a private club. And unfortunately, he didn't, he was a shyster. He was all talk and no action.
Right.
And, he said he had these mailing lists of all these celebrities, and he could get them in there, and it'd be a private club. And he actually got a couple of people to look at the place. I had to show Sylvester Stallone the place once because he was thinking about investing in it.
Mm.
It's kind of funny because I'm 6'3", and he's about 5'7". So I thought Rocky was coming in, but it was like this little guy in cowboy boots.
Oh, my God.
But he seemed like a nice guy, and I showed him around the place.
Yeah.
But it turned out the guy didn't really know what he was doing, but then he talked Mitzi into renovating the place, and he hired an architect for like $1 zillion. He hired a crew, and they started to demolish the interior. But I was thinking, Mitzi, did you get the permission from the owner? Because she wasn't the owner. She was just a renter. She was the leaseholder, and she didn't. And so one day, the place was gutted. The owner came by, looked in the window, and said, "What the hell is going on?" And he said, "You broke the lease because you're supposed to get permission from me to do any kind of construction, anything. If you change a doorknob, you're supposed to get permission." And the place had been gutted. So she, instead of like just cutting bait and, cutting her losses, she said, "Oh, please let me keep the place, and I'll pay you like, $5,000 more a month to keep it." And he saw a sucker, and he said, "Okay, sure." So she was paying all this money to keep the place going, but it didn't go. Eventually, revenues at the Comedy Store were down, and eventually it went back to him, and she lost $1 million or millions of dollars, lots and lots of money. But she did things like that, which to her were great ideas, and they were if you knew what you were doing. But she didn't really know. She wanted to start a comedy channel, and she called it the Comedy Channel. She actually fought Comedy Central because Comedy Central at the time was starting up through Viacom, I guess, at the time, and they were calling it Comedy Channel.
Mm-hmm.
But she had already trademarked the name Comedy Channel, and so they had to change it to Comedy Central. But she rented these rooms, these offices, next door to the Comedy Store. And she redecorated these offices with hundreds of thousands thousands of dollars worth of antiques and new carpeting and new wall coverings and, everything. And because she was going to have the Comedy Channel run out of that thing. The Comedy Channel was supposed to be sketch comedy and stand-up comedy shows that she would film and sell to, like a Viacom thing to have a channel on cable.
Right.
Just like Comedy Central was. But the shows, she actually taped the shows, and they weren't very good, and she couldn't sell them. But she made these offices, spent lots of money, and then nothing ever happened. She just kept paying the rent on these things. And then one day she found out that the windows in her office didn't open. And the offices were in a historic building, which is right next door to the Comedy Store. Mm-hmm. They used to be a hotel, I think, at one time, and I think Marilyn Monroe stayed there or something. And it was like one of those Hollywood landmark kind of places. But they allowed it to become an office building. But then the owners had it designated a historical monument or something because of its history, because they thought they can get more rent or whatever. And it turned out that she couldn't do anything about the windows. And Mitzi kind of had a phobia about windows. Had a couple of phobias, but one of them, like when I would open her office in the mornings when she would come in, I had to open the windows. She had to have the windows open for a little bit of time before she came in. I did a lot of other little rituals too. I used to have to peel Granny Smith apple, cut it into slices, place the slices in order on a silver plate, and then in the middle put these blanched almonds that she liked. I had to have that set on her desk when she came in, and then I had to light a votive candle, one of those little red glass candles.
Yeah.
And that had to be on her desk too.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And the window had to be open. So she never went back to that office or used it because the windows couldn't be opened. and lost so much money. Then she had an idea to open a theater, which again was a great idea if you knew what you were doing. But she wanted it to be the Comedy Store Playhouse and to be open for comedians to stretch and do plays or do one-man shows and that type of stuff. Because at that time in the late 80s, one-man shows was a big thing. And it's a great idea, but she bought a theater that had no parking whatsoever. Oh. And so instead of, researching the whole thing and getting some people that know about real estate and everything, she just went ahead and she bought a house next door to it, a 4-unit rental house, and decided to knock it down. Huh. And she went ahead to build parking, but it was a tiny lot. She couldn't have got much parking on it. As a matter of fact, she had me be the front man as the buyer, because she didn't want them to know that, the Comedy Store was buying it. So it was so funny, I had to write a check for $50,000 or something on my own checking account, which I had never seen $50,000 in my life, and give them the check to hold as a down payment or whatever. And it turned out that it was not zoned for parking. She found this out later. This is after she already evicted the tenants. She had to pay them each like $2,000 to move out. She took out the electrical system and the electrical box. She had that removed. And we were talking thousands and thousands of dollars. And then she found out that only a sliver of the property was owned commercial for that type of thing. So the city said, no, you can't build a parking lot here. The only way you can do it is if you take, there were, I think, 4 units. She would have to build a building someplace else in Los Angeles, or in Hollywood actually,
mm-hmm.
with 4 low-income housing units in it. So we're talking like, $1 million. And that's the only way she could have used that property. So she decided to turn it back into a rental place. And she put the electrical back in, and we started to rent it out. Of course, I had to collect the rents, and it was a nightmare. So she would rent to, like, comedians, up-and-coming comedians, and comedians don't pay their rent.
Yeah.
They just don't, and that was a nightmare. And the theater, so she didn't learn her lesson from I got to say all this, Mitzi's not a stupid person, but she just was bullheaded, and she just would go ahead and cart before the horse. She was like the epitome of cart before the horse.
Yeah.
So instead of, again, just cutting bait, and just getting out of there, she decided to buy the motel on the other side of the theater. This rundown prostitution motel on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
So figuring she could knock that down. So we would go to city meetings with this guy named Michael Wu, who was the councilman for Hollywood, and we would try to get his support because it was a dump. It would be nice to have it knocked down because it was prostitution and drugs and all that stuff. But he kept he never did a handshake, but he kind of gave us a feeling that he would be behind it. But he never did. He chickened out. So, of course, we found out that we could not knock it down. And also we found out later that it wouldn't have been enough spaces anyway, that the footprint of the motel, you could only do like a 3-story parking garage. You couldn't do like a flat parking place, parking lot.
Yeah.
So then she had to run a motel. And
wow.
She had comedians running the motel. Don Barris, Don Barris.
Yes.
Don Barris was one of the managers of the motel. And it was like, she fixed it up. She painted it and stuff like that. And, she did the right thing as far as trying to make the business run, but she didn't know how to run a motel. And the place was a dump. It was right next door to all the other dumps that were all, the rooms were rented by the hour to prostitutes,
Yeah.
So all that stuff kind of, towards the end of the 90s made, the cash flow was not the best. And so I was saying all this for an example as to she wouldn't listen to other people. She would hire these CPAs and these big accounting firms that were like, top accounting firms, and they would tell her, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to liquidate this, and she wouldn't listen to them. So she'd fire them and get somebody else, and she'd fire them and get somebody else. And we went through like 5 different CPAs and like 5 or 6 different accounting crews, in the office. Mm-hmm. And that's, so that was the side of Mitzi that was so bizarre to me. And so I had to be the guy that would translate to these people what she wanted, because they would all cock their heads like a dog going, what?
Yeah.
Like their ears would go up and they cock their heads like, huh? And, because she would want something that made no sense. And these are guys that were facts and figures guys, that they're numbers crunchers, and they just didn't understand what she was talking about. And that when my job was to do that with them, it was to be the translator, the Mitzi translator, and that went all the way down to like the cleaning crew and the plumbers and the all that stuff. She would just say, "Get it done." And then I'd have to go to these guys and say, well, she wants this knocked down and this. And they would say, well, you can't do that. You have to get a permit. You have to bring it up to code. And then I would go back to her, and she'd say, "No, just do it." Like, but Mitzi, you can't. One of my favorite stories is she in that theater that she bought. In the back of the theater was a patio, and the guy who owned it before used it as kind of a pre-show bar, but I think it was just wine and beer or something.
Yeah.
And there were tables out there, and there were these big avocado trees, which I thought were very weird. And they were very old, and they were very tall, and they would produce avocados that would fall onto the ground above these tables. And there was a little kitchen there, too. So she had this idea to create a restaurant in that space. And one of the things she wanted to do, and this is like the quintessential Mitzi idea, she wanted to call the place the Monkey Bar and serve alcohol. There eventually was a place called the Monkey Bar, but it had nothing to do with her. We wanted to call the Monkey Bar, and she wanted to get live monkeys, buy them, and have them live in the avocado trees as like the attraction. Like there's live monkeys living in the avocado trees, and everybody was like, yeah, right, okay, sure. But she was serious, and she actually wanted live monkeys who would be throwing their crap at the patrons after getting hit on the head with an avocado, you know, in the trees, just kind of hanging out. And I tried to tell her, you can't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's health laws, there's all kinds of laws that say you can't do that. But she wouldn't take no for an answer. And so at that time, this is like the late 80s, there was no internet. So I had to go and research how to get monkeys to live in trees in a restaurant. And I had to call like the animal control people and the zoo. And I called this place called the Wildlife Way Station, the place where they took in old circus animals and old, zoo animals to live out the rest of their lives. And they all said, you're nuts. You can't do that. And I finally got like the definitive answer, which was basically you can do it, except you have to have a zoologist, a licensed zoologist on staff 24 hours a day. You have to have cages built that were to a certain spec, and then you could only do certain things at certain time. It was obvious. You'd have to build a zoo. You couldn't just throw a monkey up in a tree and go home.
Yeah.
And so finally, after I had all this information, she finally understood that she wasn't going to be able to do it. But that was like a typical Mitzi decision. It was like everybody would always just roll their eyes and go, well, that's Mitzi.
Yeah. Oh, my God. I've heard from some people that Mitzi was never the same again after the strike in 79, and that some would argue that, because she was married to a comic, she held a lot of resentment towards comics.
Yeah, I mean, she did. She held a lot of resentment towards a lot of people, but I don't think she held resentment towards comics in general. As a matter of fact, she had a very weird relationship with comics. I mean, she dated comics. Argus was one of her boyfriends, and Steve Landisberg was one of her boyfriends. He was from Barney Miller. I don't know if you remember that show from the 70s.
Right.
And so she didn't but she liked Bad Boys. It was the comics that, like Sam Kinison, those type of guys, she always had some kind of an affection towards. And the really nice guys, she kind of dump all over them, sometimes. I mean, it was some of the comics that everybody kind of hated, who were not necessarily nice guys. She would let them walk all over her for some reason. Oh. And then, like, the nice guys, one really nice comic who was one of the nicest, I don't want to mention the name, but asked her, he was doing the Vegas. We had a comedy store in Vegas at the Dunes Hotel. And he had gotten an offer to do a television show, a television spot, which was a big deal. And he asked her if he could take one day off, fly to L.A., do the show, and then come back and finish out his gig at the Dunes. And she said no. But on the other hand, she would let other comics who were kind of just not nice guys just do whatever they want and get, it was just amazing to me. So God. I think she resented the comics who went on strike.
Oh, yeah.
But on the other hand, too, if they became famous and became successful, she would take them back in. So in other words, like Jay Leno was one of the ringleaders of the strike, but afterwards, when he started to become successful, he worked the Comedy Store. Mm-hmm. And she would hold grudges. She had a lot of grudges. One was with the Improv.
Oh, yeah. That's legendary, that feud.
Yeah, because from what I understand, basically, Bud Friedman had the Improv in New York.
Right.
I think he started in 1962.
63.
And he was the first club to have stand-up comedy as their main thing. But he also had singers and, jugglers and all kinds of other stuff. But they had stand-up comedy. So he got divorced from his wife. I think her name was Sylvia or something. And she got the Improv, the New York Improv, in the divorce, or she took it over. I'm a little cloudy on the legality of that. But he decided to move to L.A. and open an Improv here where he would be the owner, the sole owner. And he started to, scout Los Angeles. And he would come to the Comedy Store. This is in the early 70s.
Right.
He would come to the Comedy Store, and Mitzi befriended him because, he was on the Improv, and they had a lot of friends in common, and they had a lot of people in common and stuff like that.
Right.
But then he started to kind of poach the Comedy Store for comics, and she didn't like that. And then he opened the Improv on Melrose, and she started to resent that. She didn't like the competition. She didn't like competition anywhere.
Yeah.
And she started to blacklist comics that would work the Improv. But like I said, if they became famous and, they can become a draw at the Comedy Store, I mean, there were certain comedians that could work both places. Obviously, Robin Williams and, mm-hmm. those type of people, because they were such a big star that you don't stop Robin Williams from working the Comedy Store. But it hurt the little guys, the guys that hadn't made it yet, because she would, if she found out they worked the Improv, she wouldn't have them at the Comedy Store. And so that cut down on their stage time, and it cut down on their opportunity for being seen by the industry, mm-hmm. And so there became this kind of Improv comics and Comedy Store comics. And never the twain shall meet. And she actually, when I first started working there as the phone guy, she used to have me call the Improv and find out who was on the show. So that she could blacklist them from working the Comedy Store, or at least yell at them. And people had to make a choice, work for Bud or work for Mitzi. Mm-hmm. And which I always thought was kind of sad. I never understood that myself. Because at the time, there was enough to go around. It wasn't like there weren't comedians, enough comedians to work the stages. There were plenty. And it wasn't like comedy wasn't taking off. She was making a fortune. I remember when I first started working there as a piano player, and like Richard Pryor would come in to work out new material, and there would be a line down Sunset Boulevard for like, half a mile down Sunset Boulevard of people waiting to get in. And there'd be people at the door, trying to, give the doorman a $100 bill to get in to get a good seat, or back then offering cocaine, to the doorman to get in and get a good seat. And it was huge. The Comedy Store was a huge success, and the Improv did pretty well too.
Mm-hmm.
I never understood that whole reasoning that they couldn't get along. But Freeman, I actually met him a couple of times only because at the time when I first started playing piano,
mm-hmm.
while I was working for Mitzi directly, I hooked up with this comedy team called Meyer and Young. Bob Meyer and Bob Young, really great guys, funny guys, but they went on to become television producers and writers.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, they needed a piano player for their act, and so they hired me to play piano, and so I went wherever they went, and they would play at the Improv. This is before Mitzi found out, probably, and so I would go to the Improv and play for just Meyer and Young, and then leave. And Bud Freeman just always seemed to be kind of a jerk. He just seemed to be kind of a very, sure of himself, and I don't know. I didn't particularly care for the guy.
Yeah.
But I didn't really know him. I didn't know him as well as I knew Mitzi. But that's like the kind of weird side of Mitzi. The other side of Mitzi, she was very nice to people. She could be. When we did the NBC special in 1988, it was a special. It was the 20th. It was the 15th anniversary of the Comedy Store.
Mm-hmm.
On NBC. It was like a 90-minute special. We filmed it. We taped it at the Universal Amphitheater. It was huge, 6,000 people. It had everybody. Every famous comic at the time was on that show. As a matter of fact, it ran the show ran like 3.5, 4 hours. It was like...
I kind of remember it too, yeah.
I was backstage with Mitzi, and I had David Letterman, and, everybody that came out of the Comedy Store, and plus other comics,
Yeah.
And she took the proceeds that she got from NBC, and she started an anti-drug foundation.
Right.
And she actually donated one of her houses. She owned this house above the Comedy Store.
Crest Hill
Avenue, yeah.
Yeah.
And she donated it to this foundation because a lot of comics were, trying to, Argus. Argus was cocaine and alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
He went through a bunch of different rehabs until it finally took. And he's been sober for 30-something years. But there were a lot of guys in the late 80s were heavily into cocaine. Obviously, the Sam Kinison, crowd. And so she offered them a place to, like a halfway house. And she donated a lot of money towards that. So she did things like that she didn't have to. And,
yeah.
Like I say, she did nice things for some people. She did nice things for me, So I don't want to give the impression that Mitzi was the Wicked Witch of the West.
Yeah.
She could be very frustrating as a human being. I think that's the nicest word.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, she could be, very sweet to people and help people and understand the underdog, because she kind of basically was. When she started out, she grew up in a place called Menominee, Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because people always think she's like from New York or something, but she was a farm girl from Menominee, and she was like the only Jewish person in Menominee, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And so like when you do her voice, I guess everybody has done her voice to you, right?
Oh yeah, everybody.
Yeah, it's like oh, but the way to do it the right way, you have to do it with the Wisconsin accent, which is all. It's kind of Frances McDormand in Fargo.
Yeah.
with on helium,
Yeah.
It's like oh, okay, go over there and do that. So but she started out that, and she met Sammy Shore because he was kind of an itinerant comedian, and they hooked up, and then she had a kid named Scott, her oldest son,
Mm-hmm.
and then she kind of got into the business through Sammy Shore. They would travel the Borscht Belt and all around, and eventually they landed in Beverly Hills because he was the opening act for Elvis. Elvis loved him, and so at the International in Vegas, and he made good money opening for Elvis, and so they bought a house in Beverly Hills, and then stuff like that. But Sammy, God rest his soul, he just passed away recently.
Right.
He was an alcoholic, and he started the Comedy Store as kind of a place for his buddies to hang out and comedy. And it didn't really care if it made money or not. He rented a room in the building that used to be Ciro's, and Mitzi actually came up with the name Comedy Store, and she was the ticket taker, and she was she took the money. She was in the box office, what they call the cover booth.
Right.
And Sammy and his buddies, Shecky Green or any of those guys from Vegas,
Rudy DeLuca,
all those guys, as they were passing through, they would come in and just go up on stage. It wasn't like an organized thing. And then in 1974, they got a divorce, and he didn't really care about the Comedy Store, so she got it in the divorce. But she was very smart, and she understood, and she saw that there weren't any places for just stand-up comedy. Because like all the clubs out in the hinterlands, the Hungry Eye in San Francisco, or the place in Chicago, I can't remember the name. They were like jazz clubs with comedians, or coffee houses with comedians as part of the bill. They weren't strictly comedians; they were strictly stand-up. And so she came up with that concept of having comic after comic after comic, and people thought she was nuts. That she, in the other places you had a comic, but then you had to have a dancer singer, and then you had to have a magician or something, and then you could have another comic.
Yeah.
She had comic, stand up the whole night, like 20 guys, and it took off, and it provided places for guys to be bad and to learn and to become better. And when Johnny Carson moved the Tonight Show in 1972 to the West Coast, the Comedy Store became the place to go to try and get on the Tonight Show to work out their act.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Walker was like the first big star out of the Comedy Store. Although Richard Pryor worked there, but at the time Richard Pryor was on the skids. Mm-hmm. And but Jimmy Walker kind of made the Comedy Store because he had a huge hit TV show, and he had a catchphrase, and and everybody knew who he was, so people would come down to see Jimmy Walker, and then they would see 10 other comics that they never heard of, but were going to become the next Jimmy Walker. Yeah. The Gary Shandlings and all those people, and then it became like, wow, this is the place to go to see stand-up comedy.
Right.
So she was not dumb, and she knew what she was doing. It's when she branched out from that when things just kind of got weird.
Yeah. So I heard, God, that place was just insane when Sam Kinison hit it big, and there's a lot of fights and stabbings and stuff with the.
Well, that was actually actually from a different thing. I mean, Sam didn't, he took care of business at the Comedy Store. I mean, he would be high, and he'd have all his rock and roll friends in the audience. But what happened was, there's a guy named Joe Torre, not the baseball manager.
Yeah.
And she wanted to do a series of specialty shows, which nowadays would be considered racist, but back then it was considered, like some sort of I can't think of the word, a great idea, where she had like a Jewish show.
Yeah.
Or she would have an Italian show.
Yeah.
She had an African American show. And the African American show was called, what the hell is it called? I just left my mind. I mean, the shows they had names of, now it would be considered racist, like the Goomba show or something. Or,
yeah.
Or, they had, the people on the show were of one nationality or one race. And so it was like Def Jam comedy.
Yeah.
Which was big in the early 90s.
Like blue-collar comedy. Yeah.
Oh, Fat Tuesday. It was called Fat Tuesday, P-H-A-T Tuesday. And so Tuesday nights in the main room, Joe Torre would have this show. And it was all African-American, and the audience was all African-American. And not that all African Americans are gang members, because they're not, but a lot of gang members showed up because one of the things was they would show up to buy like 5 bottles of Cristal, at $100 a bottle, to show that they had, the roll, that they had these stacks, of cash. And we had gang fights during those shows. Mitzi thought it was funny. She had a very strange sense of humor, but there were shootings, and there was once when it fell out onto Sunset Boulevard, and some guy took a shot at another guy, and it just barely missed this guy named George Drew, who was one of the nighttime managers. The bullet just went right by his head.
Wow.
And he went to Mitzi and told her, and she laughed. So, yeah, that was most of the bad police involving incidents were from the Fat Tuesday shows. And but Sam, Sam was just Sam. He had what I used to call his satellites.
Oh, yeah. I heard you're the originator of that term, satellite comics.
Yeah, because they would just hang around him. They would be buzzing around him, and he made them who they were, in a sense, because I remember once he did a New Year's Eve concert at the Universal Amphitheater, and you had all these comics that nobody ever heard of, but they were all his satellite guys, and Mark Maron was one of them at the time.
Yeah.
And basically, they were all his drug buddies, and he would have them on stage, and all these guys started to get a little swell-headed because they were on. I just did the Universal Amphitheater with 6,000 people with, but I never said it to their faces, but everybody was thinking, but you wouldn't be there if Sam Kinison wasn't on stage,
Yeah.
And so those guys, I can't name names, but there were a bunch of those guys who actually went on. Some of them went on to become, like Mark Maron. God bless him. He went on to become incredibly successful. And he was a nice guy. I knew him when he was a doorman.
Yeah.
He was a real nice guy. I never had a problem with him or anything like that. But some of the other guys were heavily into drugs. And Kinison would, he would do stuff when he was high, like up at Crest Hill, that house. He would trash the place, He'd throw furniture, $1,000 chair out the window, that type of stuff. Because it was rock and roll. It was the thing to do if you're into rock and roll. The Hyatt Hotel next door to the Comedy Store, it's something else now, but it used to be called the Rock and Roll Hyatt. because that's where like Led Zeppelin would stay and throw the TV set out the window, and that's where where all the rock and roll guys would trash their rooms.
Yeah.
So it was that whole '80s mentality of hair band stuff, and they would all, and he was part of that. He was part of that whole drug hair band, and he was a hair band wannabe without the hair. Yeah. He was losing his hair. That's why he wore the beret and all that stuff.
One of my favorite stories, Mark Maron asked Steve Pearl if he wanted to go back to Crest Hill to hang out with Kinnison, and Steve said, "I don't want to hear another story about how Sam invented paper and the printing press and gravity."
Right. Yeah. I mean, Sam, I never really had a problem with Sam. When he started out, he lived in his car in the Comedy Store parking lot, and he would come upstairs to wash up in the bathroom across from my office. And he brought his guys from Texas, Carl LeBeau, who I think we talked about this once. I actually like Carl LeBeau. I mean, I appreciated Carl LeBeau more than I appreciated Sam as far as talent. I always thought Carl was the talented one.
Yeah.
Because Carl had a physicality and physical relationship with comedy that was unique and different.
Mm-hmm.
And Sam, to me, had a couple of good jokes, but it was all kind of a gimmicky thing. The screaming, yelling, and the basically the misogynist drug guy.
Yeah.
I didn't get that.
Is it true that he stole some jokes from Blake Clark?
That I don't know. Have you talked to Blake?
I haven't talked to Blake, but I heard a few people say that some of Sam's Vietnam jokes are Blake's.
It's possible. I don't see it. I mean, Sam wasn't known for that, but on the other hand, it could have been something when he first started out because he was a doorman.
Yeah.
And Blake was a doorman, but Blake started to get successful and he got on a Tonight Show, and then he became known as the Vietnam comic. But Sam wasn't really known for that, but it's totally possible. I mean, when Richard Pryor started out in the early 60s, like 64, and he would work these little coffee houses, he did Bill Cosby's act.
Yeah.
So everybody did like other people's jokes if they could get away with it when they're first starting out, before they found their voice,
right?
Before they found out who they were and what jokes fit them. And sometimes it takes a long time. And there's some people that stole jokes, that's because they just weren't good enough.
Yeah.
But a lot of them would do jokes just to have enough material, would steal jokes to pad their own act because they didn't have enough stuff to go on stage. But Sam maybe that could have happened in the beginning before Sam found his persona.
Yeah.
I mean, Andrew Dice Clay was an impressionist when he first started.
Yeah, he did Travolta and Jerry Lewis. Yeah.
He did anybody with a New York accent. And, so people, when they're starting out, there's all kinds of... But after a while, Sam could only be Sam because that's what people wanted. I don't know. I haven't talked to Blake in a long time. I love Blake. Blake's a wonderful guy.
Yeah, he seems like it. He seems like it. I heard him on the Comedy Store podcast recently. He did a pretty good episode with them.
Oh, yeah? I'll have to listen to that. Yeah, I'm friends on Facebook with him, but I haven't talked to him in many years. I haven't talked to any of those guys face-to-face in a long time.
Yeah. So did you started the same time as Lori Jacobson? Yeah,
Lori was a waitress, and we knew each other from then. And she wrote a book. It's kind of weird that my relationship with Lori started in a weird way.
Mm-hmm.
you know about the ghosts of the Comedy Store?
Of course.
Well, I actually saw one of the ghosts, and it was a strange thing. What happened was I was in my office with George Drew, who was the manager, and we were on a speakerphone with Mitzi, and we were talking to Mitzi on a speakerphone. She asked me a question, and I said, I don't know, I'll have to call somebody. So I left my office. I went out, just outside my office, there was another telephone there that I could use. George stayed in my office talking to Mitzi. And across from that phone that I was about to use was the switchboard. So there was a guy named Danny Herron, and he was working the switchboard. So as I had my peripheral vision towards Danny at the switchboard, and I was on the phone talking to whoever it was, and then all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a guy walk into my office. And I looked at Danny, and I said, who is that? And he said, I don't know. And so I got off the phone, I went into my office, and there was nobody in there except George. And I said, did you see a guy come in here? And he said, no, nobody came in there. And it was like, what the hell was that? So Laurie wrote a book called Hollywood Haunted. It was about all the major landmarks in Hollywood that were haunted. And one chapter was the Comedy Store, because obviously she worked there.
Mm-hmm.
And when she would promote the book, every Halloween, she would try to promote the book. And she would get somebody from the Comedy Store to appear on television to do a ghost story. Like Blake saw the ghosts, Joey Gaynor saw the ghosts, waitresses saw the ghosts. There was all kinds of famous stories. And so she got me to do one of those shows. I did a local, I think it was called, I don't know if it was local or it was national, something called Mike and Maddie. It was like a talk show in the 90s. And then she got me to do Unsolved Mysteries. And so I portrayed myself in Unsolved Mysteries, and they do my story. They also do Blake's story, and they do Joey Gaynor's story. And so that's how I hooked up again with Laurie. And 4 or 5 years ago, I had an idea to maybe write a book. It had been time that I had been away from the Comedy Store long enough that I thought maybe it was time to put all the stories down.
Mm-hmm.
And so I contacted Laurie because two things. First of all, I had been a screenwriter. I was writing scripts from 92 on, and I knew how to write a script, but I didn't know how to write a book, and especially a nonfiction book. So the light went on. I said, Laurie Jacobson, that's what she does. She writes nonfiction Hollywood books, and she worked at the Comedy Store. So I thought she'd be perfect. So we hooked up. We signed a little agreement between each other,
mm-hmm.
and we started to work on the book. But then I had some medical problems, and I got sick, and it kind of floated away. It's still in the ether. I'm still working on it, but it didn't come to fruition as fast as I thought it was going to.
Yeah.
So it's still there. But Laurie's great, and she has so many stories. She knows everybody.
Yeah.
And she's like the perfect person to write a book about Hollywood.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, the ghosts, I don't know what I saw. I could have seen, both of us could have seen a reflection or something. So I've never really been a big believer in ghosts. And as a matter of fact, one night at the Comedy Store, I went up into the belly room like late at night after a few drinks, and I just, because that's where the ghosts were supposed to be, concentrated.
Yeah.
And because supposedly the gangsters shot people up in the belly room and then threw their bodies into the Hollywood Hills. But I went up there one night and just said, "Okay, ghosts, if you're here, come and get me." And there was pitch black, and I just stood there because I was drunk, and that's why I did it. But nothing happened, of course. And so I don't know if I believe in the ghost stories, but there's enough of them, and there's enough weirdness that it could be true. But on the other hand, you've got comedians who do that stuff all the time to other people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That do pranks and jokes, and that's what they do for a living. So I don't know if the ghosts are real.
Yeah, the first time I went there in 2016, I was out in LA for 8 days. I wanted to see if I could get stage time anywhere, and I had been out of the loop with the Comedy Store for quite some time. I didn't know that Mitzi wasn't running it anymore and that she was sick. I didn't know all that stuff. And the Comedy Store podcast had just started, but it didn't have an audience yet, so I didn't know anything. So I go there with a friend, and we're walking up the ramp, and I get a shudder down my back because I know that's where Steve Lubekin landed. It's just...
Right at the Hyatt.
Yeah.
Parking lot.
It's just so profound. And so we go inside to the original room, and those headshots on the wall are so spooky because you see all these comics when they were young that are super famous, and then you see these guys that you never heard of, and you think, whatever happened to them? You know, who's dead and who's not? It's just really, really spooky.
Yeah.
And then I go into the OR, and I could have swore I saw like smoke coming from the red neon lights, and that there was, there was the presence of dead comedians in the room, like Richard and Sam and Robin, and it just like I felt like Jack Nicholson in The Shining, like I had always been there.
Right.
It was just a really profound feeling.
I've had that too, of kind of that spiritual feeling. Just being in the Comedy Store itself, when I first started sitting in the main room at the piano and thinking that, when this was Ciro's in the 40s and 50s, all these Hollywood stars would hang out there. That was one of their hangouts. Mm-hmm. The Coconut Grove and Billy Gray's Bandbox and Ciro's. Those are the places that everybody went to. And so I was thinking, I'm sitting in a chair, and maybe Humphrey Bogart sat next to me at one time. So you feel that spiritual kind of thing about the history of the Comedy Store. And one time we did a huge renovation in 1986, 87. And what we would call the kitchen was basically a service bar. It was a pretty big space. I think she has they serve food in there now. I haven't been back to the Comedy Store in 22 years. But there was this kind of a countertop that had underneath it were these grills, these cast iron, huge food, for grilling food, grilling hamburgers.
Yeah.
And we had to get rid of them. I had to call a junk dealer to take them away. And underneath there was a bucket of grease that had probably been under there for, 60 years or 50 years. And I kind of like worshiped that bucket of grease for a few days because I was thinking that, Humphrey Bogart's hamburger was cooked in that grease, or whoever, Burt Lancaster's, fried egg sandwich came in that, was cooked in that grease. It's a very unique feeling in that place because of the history, because of the, I guess that's why people go to museums. I mean, I go to a museum, and when I see a Rembrandt or something in an art museum, it's like, you go, oh my God, this existed, 500 years ago. And, and that's like right there. And the same, molecules that touched this 5 years ago are touching me, It's a very strange spiritual feeling.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's one thing about the Comedy Store.
I was curious. What did Laurie look like in 1981?
She looked the same. She had the same haircut with the bangs and the reddish hair and and the glasses. I mean, as far as I know, she looks pretty much the same as she did then, as in the pictures that I've seen. See, the thing is, when we started working on the book, I hadn't seen her in a long time, and I still haven't seen her. We worked on the book over the phone and over the internet because she lives up north. She lives in, near San Jose somewhere?
Santa Rosa. Her and John Provost, her husband. Yeah.
And the other thing, the other reason the book hasn't been going is because she's so busy.
Yeah, she's very busy.
She does, she manages all the TV stars from the past and everything. And her husband is John Provost, who is Timmy from Lassie. And he, so she's always going to conventions and all around the place. Plus, she writes. I think she just did a book on the Beatles. In Shea Stadium and Hollywood Bowl or something.
Yeah. Oh my God, I was supposed to meet her at a convention a couple of weeks ago. Finally, after interviewing her twice, and then I couldn't make it down because of a family emergency. But eventually I will meet her. I was curious because I saw a picture of her when she was in high school. She had blonde hair, and she was this, free-spirited hippie chick,
Yeah.
But now she looks like Velma from Scooby-Doo.
Yeah. Well, maybe she changed when she worked the Comedy Store or something, but I kind of remember her. At least her face is pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Which is a good thing.
She's a pretty lady, yeah.
She's she hasn't aged,
Yeah.
30-something years that I've known her.
Yeah.
But she's a sweetheart. She's a good person.
Yeah, she is. She told me some great stories. Mick Jagger was there the first night she worked, and she was very starstruck. She thought she was going to get fired that night because she made so many mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's funny because when you first start work there, you're starstruck for a little bit, and then you become jaded. You become totally jaded, and it comes to the point where when famous people come in, you go, crap, because it means you're going to be staying later, Because
yeah.
What happened was, in the early days when I was just playing piano there, and Richard Pryor would come up or Robin Williams, I would be fascinated, oh my God, this is the greatest show I've ever seen. And then 5 years later, somebody would say, oh, Richard Pryor wants to go up. And I go, shit. because then that meant that he was going to do an hour in the middle of the show, which means he was going to push everybody else back an hour, which means I had to stay an hour longer and before I could go home. So you become jaded, it's nice. I mean, there's a lot of times, you meet famous people or whatever, I remember Richard Pryor came off the stage once, and he whispered in my ear. I was at the piano, and I didn't know what he was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I figured it out. He was asking me if somebody had introduced Clint Eastwood, because Clint Eastwood was sitting in Mitzi's booth. And I hadn't even noticed, because he was asking me because he wanted to introduce him from the stage. And I said, I don't think so. And so he went up and did it. But, if you were sitting in a McDonald's in, Illinois somewhere and Clint Eastwood walked in and said, it would be a big deal. But if you're sitting in the Comedy Store, at the piano after you worked there for 5 years and Clint Eastwood comes in and goes, okay, Clint Eastwood's here. It's not that big of a deal anymore.
Yeah.
I actually, I think he was there because he did a movie called Bird.
Yeah.
About Charlie Parker.
Yeah.
Jazz musician. And he filmed it at the restaurant at the Comedy Store Annex that Mitzi had that I told you about.
Mm-hmm.
He filmed Forrest Whitaker. He did an exterior, and I think he did an interior of the bar. And it was at night, like on a Tuesday night or something like that, and I stayed back to make sure everything went well because I was the contact person. And he was really nice. He was very, very nice to everybody. And, you know, it was on Sunset Boulevard. So, of course, there were tourists, and it was just down Olive Street right off of Sunset. And so people were starting to line up because they realized it was Clint Eastwood. And he just went over to him and signed autographs and was nice and everybody. And then he said, you know, we're filming here, so you can be cool. And everybody was cool. So he's a good guy.
That's good. Did you go to Mitzi's memorial?
No, I couldn't. I was actually in a nursing home trying to get over an infection. I had a hip replaced that got infected, and I had to have 9 more surgeries to kill the infection. So last year, I was laid up. I didn't have a hip. It was before they replaced the hip, and I didn't have a hip in my body on my right side. So I couldn't get up. I literally couldn't even get into a wheelchair. And I was really upset that I couldn't go. But Peter called me and stuff, Peter Shore, who was a great guy. And he invited me and everything, but I told him I couldn't make it.
Yeah, I interviewed Carrie Snow the day before the memorial, and then 4 days after that is when she had her stroke.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that. I saw that. How's she doing now? When's the last time did you talk to her since? I heard she's doing pretty good.
About a month later, I messaged her on Facebook, and we talked for a little bit. But I do keep up to date with her on Facebook. She looks like she's doing well. She's going through therapy and everything.
Great. Yeah, I think because I've seen her comment on other things on Facebook, and it seems like she's fine. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
She, you know, I don't know how she is physically, but her brain is okay. You know?
Yeah, I think she's active and she's doing good. So
she's a good person.
So you left the Comedy Store in '98?
Yeah, it was not a happy thing. That's when I first had I've had 4 hip implants over the last 20 years, and that was when I had my first hip implants. Both of my hips fell apart for an unknown reason. They call it idiopathic because it's a bunch of idiots that don't know what they're talking about. And they had to replace both my hips. And so the year and a half before that time, I was in and out of the office because I could barely move. My office is on the 2nd floor, and I could barely get up the steps. Mm-hmm. And so I was out a lot, and Mitzi didn't like that. And she was going through Parkinson's disease. Mm-hmm. She had it started like at early 90s. She started to do a little tremors, and then it was hard for her to walk and hard for her to get up the steps and everything. And she knew my mother died from Parkinson's, from side effect of Parkinson's. Mm-hmm. And she knew that. Mitzi knew that. And she was in complete denial about the Parkinson's. She didn't want to believe it. And I saw that it was definitely Parkinson's because I recognized it in my mother. There are very specific symptoms to Parkinson's, which are weird. One is that your handwriting becomes really small, but it's still perfectly formed. It's just really small. And Mitzi's signature started to get really small. And there's this thing called the mask, where your face starts to like drag down, like you know, in a frown, and it's hard to smile. It's hard to laugh. And then the other thing is you do the shuffle, where Parkinson's people don't pick up their feet anymore. They shuffle one foot in front of the other. Yeah. And she had all those symptoms, and my mother had those symptoms. So she didn't want to know about it. She didn't want to know that she had Parkinson's. I mean, she went down to Mexico for, what do you call that? Quack treatments and that stuff. And so I went into the hospital, had my hips replaced 2 weeks out of the hospital. I got a letter in the mail, certified mail, from her attorney, who was actually also a comedian. And in the letter, it said, my job no longer existed. Thanks a lot, see you, bye. That was it. That was it. I never heard from her again.
Oh, my God.
And, yeah, and I was stunned, just absolutely stunned. I'd been there for 17 years, and I had done all kinds of stuff for her and for everybody there, and it was just, she just didn't want me in anymore. I think there was a bunch of reasons. I think she thought she was paying me too much money, because at that time, it was the Comedy Store was doing not great.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Parkinson's thing might have been a minor part of it. And then, I think she just didn't want to have to pay anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. And it was very, 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 very disheartening and depressing. And it took me a long time to get over it. As a matter of fact, she even, I went to the labor board because she owed me like weeks and weeks of vacation, because she would do this to me all the time. She would say, okay, you're going to have, you have 2 weeks of vacation a year. Okay, great. Then I would book it, or I would, plan for the vacation. And like a day or two before, she would tell me, no, you can't go. We have a big deal happening. We got this going on. We got the comedy thing. We got the whatever. And so I would cancel my vacation. And I would, not take it. And then the year would go by, and I still didn't take my vacation. And I remember one time I said, well, how about this? How about if I just take Fridays off for a couple of months or something, something like that, just so I can get those days. And she reluctantly agreed to that. On the first Friday that I took off, she called me to come back in. And so I never got my vacations, I mean, she did let me go back when my parents passed away, so she was nice about that. I was gone a couple of weeks or more when my mother died, and my father died a few years before that, and she let me go back to New York and stay there for a little while, a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks. But I never got my vacation, so I went to the labor board, and she sent a lawyer to fight me.
Ugh.
She sent a lawyer to, I went to the labor person, and I said, no, we had an agreement, 2 weeks a year, and I never got them, and she never paid me for them. So I want that money. It was a few $1,000s. And so the lawyer's there, the labor woman looked over to the lawyer. She said, well, what's the Comedy Store's position? And the lawyer said, well, Mitzi told me that she had paid Mr. Becker and that he got all his money. So we don't know why he's bringing this up. And I said, no, I didn't. I never. And Mitzi would do that with lawyers and accountants. She would tell them what she wanted them to think. She didn't want to tell them bad news. She would tell them, oh, I gave him that money, when she basically knew she didn't,
Yeah.
And then the lawyer would be red-faced in the, showing up for the thing, because they would say, well, that's what Mitzi said. So the labor board lady said to the lawyer, well, where's your canceled checks? Because that's how you prove that you paid somebody. And you have to keep your canceled checks for 7 years or whatever it is. And she said, well, we don't have any. And it's like, well, this is dumb. That's your case. So she, unfortunately, the labor woman gave the lawyer 2 weeks to come up with the canceled checks. And I knew that she couldn't. And so I got nothing out of that meeting. I go home. I'm broke now. I can't even pay my rent. And I have no money in the bank. And the lawyer starts making all these procedures with the labor board to stall me, to stall the it was supposed to be 2 weeks, then it was 4 weeks, then it was another 2 weeks, another 4, and it was like I was dying. I was starving to death. And so they called me, the lawyer, Mitzi's lawyer called me and said, look, we'll pay you some of it, but we're not going to pay you all of it, as long as you just sign off and say, So they paid me like, a quarter of what they owed me. And I took it because I was dying. And I had to sign a paper. So that was the bad side of Mitzi.
Good Lord.
And I never talked to her again. That was 1998.
Oh.
I never spoke with her again. I never been back to the Comedy Store except for recently, about 6-7 months ago, I did the Comedy Store podcast with Eleanor Kerrigan.
Right.
Total sweetheart. And
Eleanor's hilarious.
well, that was the first time I had been back there since 1998. But I only went into the little podcast booth down in the basement. I didn't go up to my old office or any of the old offices or anything, because actually I couldn't. I was still not walking very well, which I'm still not walking very well. But so that was, that's when I left. It was very upsetting. But Peter Shore was very nice to me last year when I was in that nursing home for a year. And, I still have buddies. I still have friends from the Comedy Store who have always been my friends and will always be my friends. And I'll never, that was like a big chunk of my life.
Yeah.
The Comedy Store.
It was an important chapter of your life.
Yeah. A lot of fun. A lot of fun. There was a lot of tears and a lot of laughter, as they say,
Yeah. So before your knees got bad and everything, what did you do after that?
Well, writing was one thing I was doing with a guy named David Chaskin, who you know of because he wrote Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2.
Right.
And David and I have known each other since we were like 10 years old or something. We grew up together in New York. And he became a writer, obviously, in New York, and I moved out here to become something. I didn't know what yet. I didn't know if I wanted to become a writer or an actor or a songwriter because I was playing piano. And he wrote Nightmare on Elm Street, and he wrote a couple of the horror movies, and then he wanted to write comedies. And so he also realized that he would have to move to L.A. to get closer to the industry and to the agents and all that stuff. So he and his wife and his son, Harry Chaskin, who is now a director and an animator and stuff, who's also... I know all these great people. I keep saying that he's a great guy, but he is a great guy. And they moved out here in 92, and we went to a ball game, and he said, hey, do you want to write scripts with me? I want to write comedies. And I said, yeah. So we hooked up together. We wrote about 10 scripts. We sold one. It was a comedy about a dog that it was called Unleashed, and it was about a dog that got away from a guy, and it's one of those type of things.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the studio that was going to make it went out of business, and we got some money, but the movie was never made. And we wrote other stuff, but nothing ever took off. And then like some bad things happened in the 2000s. His wife passed away, and then I got sick with the hips, and so I had to take a job. I worked at a talent agency called the United Talent Agency, which is a big talent agency in Beverly Hills. But I worked in their mailroom, and I worked doing their like shipping and receiving and stuff like that. But last year, when I went into the nursing home, I was out for so long, they got somebody to replace me. So it's 1998 all over again. But I'll make it through, and I'm still writing, and I'm writing the book, and I've got ideas that I'm working with other people, and I'm still trying to sell the scripts that David and I wrote. It's a totally different world now in Hollywood because of Netflix and streaming, that it's hard to find people with, backing. I mean, the studios, that's why when you see a movie now, like on Netflix or something, there's like 500 different production companies in the beginning of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Monkey Head Pictures in association with Shoehorn Pictures, in association with, Milk Drop, because the money is all spread out all over the world now. Nobody wants to commit to anything because they don't know what the next big thing is going to be. And so you have to find, to make small pictures, you have to find these guys, with millions of dollars that just want to throw, $500,000 to make a little movie. And the only movies that get made with the big money is obviously the Marvel comics and the remakes and stuff that, they know they can make money on. That's the only things the studios make. Everything else is made by these, small investors and then they sell them to Netflix. But Netflix doesn't pay that much. A friend of mine, they made a movie for $1 million, which back in the day was like lunch money, and Netflix paid him $500,000 for rights to it. So it's very difficult, and if you're a writer, it's very difficult to find people that can get to people that have the money that want to make the movie. It's a lot different than the old days, where you had an agent that would submit it to a studio or to whatever. Anyway, it's a very difficult situation.
It's just difficult to get movies distributed nowadays. It's insane.
I mean, we wrote a horror film called The Milkman, which is it's kind of an homage to the old 80s, 90s kind of. Like remember they had the one with Corbin Burnson, which was the
dentist. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was the milkman who, in 1970s, he was a milkman, and he killed a lot of kids for a specific reason, and then the police killed him. But now in the present, he comes back as a ghost of the milkman, and he's killing kids again. And it's a kind of a dopey, it's got a lot of blood, a lot of sex, and a lot of jokes, or kind of tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
And so I thought it'd be perfect for Netflix, and I got some interest in it with a very tiny, what they call a micro production company. They make movies for like $100,000 or less. And so hopefully, something will happen there. And we'll see. I'm still trying. I'm still doing what I can.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a movie made too. I was talking to somebody in email about it now, about her directing it, and hopefully it will carry through. It's just the movies, the independent films nowadays. They're just hard to crack open.
Yeah, no, it's just nobody knows what's going to happen, so everybody's afraid of doing anything, of taking a chance. And if you're on the lower echelon, if you're not, writing the next Marvel comic movie, then it's very hard to find the people that would take the chance.
Yeah,
on it.
But eventually
you have to be at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, but eventually you do find them.
Yeah, hopefully. I hope so. I hope some of the places that I've contacted. I'm also trying to, if you know anybody that needs a script reader, I was a script reader for a time with New Line Cinema.
Nice.
And so I have plenty of samples, and I have plenty of, experience in doing coverage, script coverage. So I put that out there if anybody knows any, has a script they want covered. get in touch with me.
I certainly will, Michael, and I'm glad you've persevered through so much. And I can't tell you how honored I am that you came on the podcast today.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. I appreciate that, but I'm honored to be on it. Yeah, you're a nice guy. You're another nice guy I met.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. Well, you have yourself a great day, sir, and
Thanks.
And I hope you get that movie made.
Thanks. You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Well, there you have it. Michael Becker. Ain't he a cool dude? Great guy, great stories about the Comedy Store. God, it's such a magical, mythical place. I love the Comedy Store. If you like this video, everyone, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Add me as a friend on Facebook. Join my Tommy Kovac comedian page on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram and all that fun stuff. Well, that's all the time we have this week on Splat from the Past. Until next time, this is Tommy Throwback Kovac saying, there's no shame in living in the past because the present sucks. Later, dudes.